with the moral clarity that Prime Minister Harper exhibited when he told President Putin to his face, "Get out of Ukraine."
Bravo! Yeah!
But no one should have been surprised about that, not least President Putin himself, as Canada has been taken a very clear-eyed position on this important issue. Our position on the Ukraine crisis has been clear from the get-go. We have spoken out against Russia's reckless provocations at every single juncture. We have criticized its undermining of international norms at every global summit, and we have led the way with key allies on implementing important sanctions. We are playing our part, and then some, in NATO reassurance measures with the deployment of air, land, and maritime forces. And we have been working hard to support Ukraine's economic and political development. Like I said, Canada's position is clear. Ukraine's position is clear. So today I'd like to explore Russia's position. Winston Churchill famously said, and this quote will be familiar to all of you, "Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma." The Kremlin would take this as a compliment, unfortunately. The old Soviet concept of active measures is starting to be talked about again. Measures aimed at polluting the opinion-making process in the West. Putin's reply to the Prime Minister's comment when Putin claimed that Russia was not actually in Ukraine was a classic example. Another example came last week when the Defense Ministry called me provocative. Me provocative. For calling their actions provocative. The biggest challenge to truth in this generation is the active manipulation of information. We see this domestically in Russia, but especially in its dealings with the wider world. Unfortunately, the virtues of free societies can be exploited by those Machiavellian enough to do so. And so, reality is being attacked by ambiguity. This is being done both subtly and bluntly. Wild conspiracy theories about the cause of the downing of MH17 have been successfully propagated to a worrying number of Russians and Russian speakers in other countries. It was in this climate that a simple tweet by a member of Canada's mission at NATO was retweeted almost 50,000 times around the world. And all it did was point out a map that Ukraine was Ukraine and not Russia. I also recall a recent meeting at the UN where my Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, told the room in a sincere tone that I quote, "I hope nobody blames Russia. I hope nobody blames Russia for what's going on in Ukraine." There have been leaders who reacted to this campaign of smoke and mirrors with the firmness and clarity required. I pay tribute in particular to leaders in Europe like Radoslav Sikorski, Franz Timmerman, and Carl Bildt. But there is much to be done in separating truth from fiction. The biggest overall theme you see coming from the Kremlin is that Russia is an innocent party, or on the other side of the coin, that it's the West that is in fact the real aggressor. I think it's worth taking time to unpack this. There are four main false narratives here, in my judgment. First, the whole idea that the current crisis is the logical combination of the West's failure to respect Russia and accept Russia as a genuine partner. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the West did not discount Russia. It was embraced as a key global player. Russia was invited to join the G8 and was integrated into APEC. The NATO-Russia Council was created to enable strategic dialogue on a regular basis. And we partnered with Russia on many challenges of global importance, including the issues of non-proliferation, the challenge in the Middle East, African development, and the important fight against terrorism. We hoped earnestly that Russia would join the world as an able and proud partner, rather than return to becoming an aggressor in conflict and in chaos. The second myth propagated by Putin is that NATO is a hostile organization, an inherent threat, and a permanent adversary. Yet, not only has NATO reached out to the Russian Federation, but its activities and its operations in Europe and around the world have directly benefited Russia. From counter narcotics work in Afghanistan to counter piracy initiatives in the east coast of Africa. For 20 years, for more than 20 years, NATO has seen Russia as a strategic partner. NATO has no menacing intentions towards Russia, no matter how much Putin seems to wish otherwise. The third narrative is the idea that parts of Ukraine, Crimea, but also the so-called Nova Russia, rightfully belong to Russia. And this is also clearly false and clearly untrue. Ukraine's territorial integrity has been recognized by all members of the international community, including Russia itself. In the Budapest Memorandum 20 years ago, it was Russia, it was the Russian Federation itself, which committed in writing, and I quote, to respect the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine. In this context, Putin's illegal annexation of Crimea is all the more shameful. Finally, there is the notion that the Ukrainian people's choices since the events of Maidan undermine Russia's legitimate interests in Ukraine. And that somehow justifies Russia's provocations. This proposition isn't just false. In my judgment, it's extremely offensive. Ukraine's choice of a pro-reform and pro-European agenda, reaffirmed in recent party elections, is theirs to make, not Russia's, not ours. Putin has unnecessarily turned the issue into a choice between East and West. It was in Moscow's power to preserve a good relationship with Ukraine, its government, and its people. But it preferred subjugation to partnership. Now Moscow must accept that in the current circumstances, it can have neither. The Putin regime is not only destabilizing Eastern Europe in a way not seen in many decades, it is also weakening the very foundations of our rules-based international system and our security architecture. And I know that it's been what you have been discussing today. Moscow is violating the most basic humanitarian, legal, and even international norms of conduct. Kremlin doublespeak extends to calling on others to respect international law, even as they themselves continue to violate the core principle of the UN Charter, the sanctity of state sovereignty and territorial integrity. I've said it at summits, and we can't allow one man in the Kremlin, we cannot allow one man in the Kremlin to redraw the borders of Europe. The entire world should be alarmed because in many ways this just isn't about just Ukraine. The absence of rules, the absence of trust, made worse by aggression and deception, erodes stability and ultimately leads to chaos. This is not a lesson lost on the Russian people who have learned through very bitter experience. In this vein, Putin's recent revisionist attempt to rehabilitate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is absolutely shameful. This, coming from the leader of the country that lost more souls in World War II than any other nation. In the context of the Ukrainian crisis alone, Moscow has violated agreements reached in Geneva, in Berlin, and Minsk. Europe may soon run out of countries for the Kremlin to concede its bad faith arrangements in. I believe Putin's actions have ultimately gone against Russia's interests, and that it would be in their interest to indeed get out of Ukraine. The notion of Russian greatness is central to Russia's political identity and runs through the works of its literary titans, including, unsurprisingly, some of Putin's favorite writers. I agree that historically Russia is indeed a great nation, populated by a very proud people. But this greatness is being undermined by President Putin. Despite his ostensible intention to ensure great power status for Russia, his policies are having the exact opposite effect. He is isolating Russia and the Russian people, both politically and especially economically. The Kremlin is making Russia's historical fear of encirclement a self-fulfilling prophecy. It is turning friends into adversaries. Its attacks on Ukraine and Georgia are the most obvious examples of this. But we shouldn't forget Russia's provocations against its other neighbors. Russia routinely violates the airspace and waters of the Baltic states and of the Nordic nations. It cynically tests the resolve and responsibilities of its neighbors, NATO and non-NATO alike. At the G20, we even see the crude school bully tactic of sending warships on a course for Brisbane. But of course, in the most egregious, most immediate, and most offensive action of all, Putin wages a murderous campaign in Ukraine, which has already cost an estimated 4,000 lives. If he continues to push, he will go down in history as the man who destroyed all that was once positive in Russia-Ukraine ties. Historical, religious, cultural, even fraternal bonds sacrificed to his ruthless expansionism in Crimea, in Donetsk, and Luhansk. Putin's Russia has little to offer a forward-looking Ukraine. His Russia does not offer its own people, let alone the Ukrainian people, a future where families can prosper under the rule of law, where the will and the interests of the people matter, and where the freedom of the press, of association, and of religion can genuinely flourish. Putin can only offer the hard power of a repressive machine that runs on intimidation, propaganda, and self-censorship. So the Kremlin is alienating its neighbors, countries that have a strong interest in a balanced and healthy relationship with Moscow. In doing so, Putin's policies have led to Russia's expulsion from the G8 and sanctions from dozens of our partners and allies from around the world. The sanctions he has brought upon his country are further weakening an economy already enfeebled by too much cronyism and far too much corruption. As if this was not enough, Putin has further undermined Russia's purchasing power by banning key food imports in a self-defeating reaction to the sanctions. Russia's own central bank has warned of increased inflation because of the agri-food ban. Not only that, but Russia's oil and gas clients are now scrambling for alternatives. Putin is himself removing from the deck what he has always seen as Russia's political and economic ace in the hole: energy. Moscow's recent gas deals with China, negotiated under pressure of international sanctions, are a good example of his reduced leverage on the world stage. Some have called it old wine in new bottles, and frankly, I think they're right. And let us not forget the other cost to Russia. The other cost to Russia of Putin's campaign in Ukraine. The deaths of untold numbers of soldiers sent to kill and to die on the front, whose existence Putin persists in denying. How many more Russian mothers will lose their sons before the Kremlin relents? Just last week, military trucks labeled Cargo 200, Russia's military code for soldiers killed in action, were seen by OSCE observers crossing from Ukraine into Russia and back again. These bear sad testament to the heavy price Putin continues to demand of his people and his men and women in uniform for the privilege of pursuing a false path to global influence and power. And it doesn't have to be that way. The Russian people have and deserve a prominent place in today's international order. We must respect their legitimate pride and their desire for recognition. But these do not have to be channeled into the Kremlin's brand of virulent nationalism. The Russian people have the capacity to be patriotic without being nationalistic, fraternal without being overbearing, respected instead of being feared. Post-war Germany offers a shining example of how patriotism can flourish without chauvinism. Putin has attempted to hijack the narrative, both domestic and for international purposes. He frames relationships in adversarial terms, and his militarism affirms this approach. But we can speak past him. You see, in Canada, we are genuine friends of the Russian people. Let's not be shy about saying it, including to the Russian people directly. If history has taught us anything, it is that Russia's greatness derives from its people, from their culture, from their creativity, from their industriousness, from their bravery, and from the resilience of the Russian soul. This aggression in Ukraine is not worthy of the Russian people. The international community cannot afford not to speak out clearly against it, and neither in Russia. And on behalf of Prime Minister Stephen Harper, on behalf of the Government of Canada, I want to welcome and thank all of you in the Atlantic Council for the important work that you do, and I want to wish you the very best for the remainder of your important conference. Thank you very much. Next time I meet Putin. I have a funny friend. She said I can wear this the next time I meet Putin.
Talk about provocative.
I don't think I'll be meeting Putin anytime soon.